Learning to control how the arms and wrists move throughout the swing is one of the best skills you could ever learn if you wanted to play better golf. And yet the complexity of how the wrists and arms work throughout the swing often frustrates golfers to a level where they're never able to truly master this subject. Today, I'm going to share with you one of the most simple drills that I use on a daily basis to help golfers master the wrists and the arms in the backswing. The good news is it's definitely possible to train the correct wrist and arm movement in the golf swing. The problem is it's easier to get it wrong. There's so many ways in which your arms and wrists could move that without some structure to this and without some detail, you're probably getting this wrong. So it's very much in your interest to work with this drill that I'm going to show you to train the correct amount of wrist bend and the correct arm structure to build the most consistent swing you've ever had. To be able to show you some of the wrist movements here clearly, I'm going to be using the HACKMOTION wrist sensor during this video to highlight some of the important movements that the wrists are making. I've said before that the wrists are changing their position throughout the entire swing, and when you hear that, you might think that it's so complex you could never learn how to do this. But actually, the truth is there's a large portion of the swing where the wrists and the arm structure stay quite stable. The most volatile part of the swing would be through impact, but equally where you get this wrong very much in a large part of the way is in the takeaway. So I'm just going to show you some of the changes that you need to make and a drill that you can do, which is going to build in the perfect wrist and arm structure. When I set up to the ball and we take a look at how my wrist is organized, I've got around 20 degrees of extension in my lead wrist. That means that there's a small amount of angle or cupping in my lead wrist, and that would be pretty standard for a neutral grip like mine. My left-hand grip's quite neutral. A small amount of extension or cupping in the wrist would be normal. And then in terms of the up and down movement of the wrist, which I think many of you consider to be wrist hinge. When you talk about wrist hinge and what is it, it's the setting or the hinging or the cocking upwards of the wrists. And there's some truth to that. I think that's somewhat of a fair statement. You'll see that at setup, I have 28 degrees of ulnar deviation. That means my wrist is bent 28 degrees, downwards. Ulnar deviation is the downward cocking of the wrist. Radial deviation is the upward cocking. That's the wrist hinge that most of you would be familiar with. So when I set up, I actually have my wrist uncocked around 30 degrees. And my lead wrist is also extended slightly, as I've already mentioned. Now, if I didn't change my wrist angles at all, if I kept that same ulnar deviation, there's 31 degrees there as I hold this club. If I swung back in the backswing and tried to maintain 31 degrees right there, that's as far back as I could swing. I couldn't hit the ball very far at all. So it's clear that we need to learn to put some wrist hinge in there, but how you do that wrist hinge is the key. And here's the best part. If I take my setup and I move my club to position 2, where the shaft is parallel to the ground in the backswing, I do so in a very particular way. I move the wrist from this slightly extended condition, so we talked about how there's about 26 degrees of extension there, and I move it to a point where the shaft is parallel to the ground. I hinge my wrist, and now my lead wrist is completely flat. There's no extension, that would be twisting the club face open, and there's no excessive flexion, which would be twisting the club face closed. I can measure that using HACKMOTION, and I can see that when I go from setup, which is 23 degrees of extension, to do my exercise on my drill where I set the club, this lead wrist is now 1 degree flexed. It's effectively flat. And at the same time, as I've moved my lead wrist from extension to flat, I've also taken it from this uncocked condition and I've begun to add some radial deviation. I've begun to hinge my wrists. Now, exactly how much matters. When I'm at this checkpoint here, where the shaft's parallel to the ground, I've already shown you that my wrist is flat, and I've now got around 20 degrees of radial deviation. That's the hinging up that I was describing previously. Now, why does that matter? Why is this position here, where I set the club into this preset condition, important? Well, believe it or not, the condition that your wrists are in now, the condition I've got my lead and trail wrist into, and also my trail arm, which I'll come to in a second, the position I've got this into right now is going to be very similar to the position I have at the top. So I can build in all of this good arm and wrist structure as a drill and then train myself to keep it there, not add more, not take it away, but maintain that wrist and arm structure through my backswing and downswing and into the ball. So let me show you what that looks like when I take my setup, place my club into this preset condition where the lead wrist is basically flat. There's 5 degrees, 3 degrees of extension, and there's 16, 17 degrees of radial deviation. And when I take that same wrist and arm structure and I move my left shoulder down and under my chin to complete the backswing, and we take a look at those numbers, there's 2 degrees of extension. That means that lead wrist is still flat, and there's 15 degrees of radial deviation. That's the wrist hinge, that's the cocking or the uncocking of the wrists that you'd be somewhat familiar with. So I transported that same feel and alignments of my arm and my wrist that I preset here at P2, 2 degrees of flexion, 19 degrees of radial, and I go to the top, 3 degrees of flexion, 21 degrees of radial. It's basically the same. You can learn to take that arm structure, build it in, take it to the top and swing back down. You're going to be learning some fantastic feelings and alignments that are going to help you to become a more consistent ball striker and a better golfer. Without doubt, the biggest mistake that you are making when it comes to improper wrist hinge is misunderstanding how to set or do the radial deviation of the wrists, how to hinge the wrists effectively, which is how you would think about it. We already know that the stable wrist condition from this P2 drill position to the top of the backswing, these things should stay fairly constant. But in a quest to try and add power to your swing, maybe to incorporate more lag, you think you're supposed to hinge your wrists more, you're making the error of over flexing or bending the wrist, and then you are increasing the amount of extension in this lead wrist. Let me remind you that we're supposed to have a fairly flat wrist in this setup condition, and then that lead wrist is going to remain fairly flat. Okay, so we go from, let's say, there's 4 degrees of flexion there. Okay, that's pretty flat. To the top, we've got 4 degrees, stayed the same. If I now try to add more wrist hinge, because I think that's what I'm supposed to do, as I add more wrist hinge, so the radial number increases, it gets larger, that's more wrist hinge. Look at what happens to the extension number. It goes from almost 0, which is where I was a second ago, to 59 degrees of extension. That is directly relative and related to the club face. The more I extend my wrist, the more I open the club face. So as you're trying to add more wrist hinge, but doing it incorrectly, the adding of the additional wrist cock, the wrist set, is robbing you not only of any sort of control, it's robbing you of power. You can't hit the ball far with that swing. The open club face is leading to all of the poor compensations that you're seeing in your downswing. The steepening of the shaft, the early extension as you come through the ball, the chicken wing and the flexing of the arms as you make contact. All of these problems can be related back to club face. So if you want to get this right, you need to learn the correct wrist hinge. There's a correct amount of wrist hinge to make the swing more consistent. Let me just clarify, you certainly don't have to be measuring the wrist to be able to benefit from this drill. I just wanted to use the numbers there that the HACKMOTION wrist sensor gives me to be able to demonstrate to you how consistent some of these wrist angles and these wrist numbers can be throughout the swing. It can feel like a minefield to try and get your head around how the wrists are supposed to move. So it might be comforting to know that when done correctly, some of these wrist angles and arm structure is a lot more stable than you might believe. So here we go with how to do it without the numbers. Take your setup. I'm actually going to place the ball out in front of me here just to help you see from this angle how I do the wrist set. It's quite specific and it's important we get this right. As I'm setting my wrists, I'm doing so and I'm keeping the butt end of the golf club, the end of the grip, on top of the ball. Okay, I'm not moving the club away with my arms in this fashion. Okay, so I'm just literally setting the wrists. Now as I look down at my lead wrist, it's flat. My forearm and the back of my hand is as flat as I can make it. That's a good position for me to be in. This trail arm, as I've spoken about in previous videos, has this external rotation to it. If you haven't seen the video I made on the arm structure, I'll link that at the end of today's video. It's very worthwhile you watching and understanding the movement of this trail arm. So I'm going to put the arm into position 3, which is the external rotation, where the elbow is in front of the body. That's the give blood position that I've referred to previously. So as I set the wrist, the left wrist is flat, the right arm is externally rotated. That means it's tucked in towards the middle of my body, and the wrist angle here between the ground, or the shaft angle I should say, between here and the ground is parallel to the ground. So I'm not set more and I haven't set less. It's this nice kind of 90-degree angle between the lead arm and the shaft. That's the perfect structure to begin with. So let's take that drill and actually start making some swings. Build in that structure of the arms, trail arms in position 3. Shafts parallel to the ground and it's pointing along my toe or stance line. My left wrist is flat. Go to the top, feel like I keep the same structure. Come back down, feel like I keep the same structure. To the top, up and down. Check out these numbers at P2 where the drill is preset, and then P4, top of the backswing, look how similar those numbers are. Up and down, train that feel, and you can even then move into a follow through. You can begin to get a sense of how you transport this wrist and arm structure around your body for the entirety of the swing. And then of course, the great thing about this exercise is you can hit balls with it. Take your setup, set the wrists, get the arms and the wrists into that position, go to the top, get a feel for what we're trying to recreate, set the wrists, keep squeezing the arms, holding the wrist angles, and go ahead and hit one. I felt so solid off the club face. I know it's only a little punch drill, but the way that that felt had complete control of the club face. Very straight shot, tiny little draw. It's got 150 yards with that small swing from a static start, a drill position that you wouldn't associate with a normal swing. I've seen people take this drill and actually use it to play golf with, because so many of you get the movement of the takeaway wrong. You're rolling your wrist and twisting your forearms in such a way that you get the club out of position very quickly, and once you've done that, everything that you do from that point on is a compensation. We can take a quick look at that example of that shot there and see how stable my wrist angles were. The address number that you see on the screen there of plus 2 degrees of extension, that's a flat wrist. And HACKMOTION's picking up address as this start point here where I started the drill. Then at the top, I've got 1 degree of flexion. Again, a flat wrist. From 2 degrees of extension to 1 degree of flexion, that's a tiny 3-degree variance. That's essentially stable. That's essentially staying the same. Equally, in terms of the radial, I had 15 degrees of radial or wrist hinge built in at this point. And then at the top, when I got to the end of my backswing, I had 11 degrees. Again, very stable, very consistent. That's important if you want to be a more consistent golfer. Stable wrist and arm mechanics is going to improve the likelihood of you making better contact and controlling the direction of your shots. One more time, set the wrist, shaft parallel to the ground, shaft pointing down the toe line, end of the club on top of the ball. I've got my left wrist nice and flat and my right elbow tucked into that position 3. Couple of rehearsals just to get a sense of what I'm trying to do here. I'm really trying to maintain those arm and wrist alignments and transport those around me, using my body to help me transport those arm and wrist alignments around me. As I say, get used to feeling that start point, couple of rehearsals to get the feel, and then we go ahead and hit another one. once again, that just feels so solid, so much club face control. Tiny little draw again. That one's got 165 yards. Can you imagine how far that's gone with such a small swing from a start point that you wouldn't consider to be normal at all? Maybe you can start to see why some people would play with this. And even if you don't end up playing with this on the golf course, if you do enough practice this way on the range, you're going to train your wrist and arm structure to be so much more consistent and reliable throughout your regular swing. If you want to improve your ball striking, please try this drill. I promise you it will make a world of difference. So there you have some clarity about the correct wrist hinge in the golf swing. Right now, maybe you're someone who has too much wrist hinge, or maybe you don't have enough yet, but you'll be able to use this drill that I showed you today, build in the correct amount of wrist hinge in that setup, and take that to the top of your backswing. This will truly help you build better club face control, which ultimately leads to lower scores. If you're interested in learning more about the HACKMOTION wrist sensor that I featured in today's video, you can check the link down in the description where I'll put the information that will take you to the website where you can learn more about this fantastic product. If you're looking to pick one up, you can also use the code RobCheaneyGolf to get yourself 5% off at checkout. I mentioned in today's video the importance of the position of this trail arm and how to align it correctly. I recently made this video right here that discusses in detail the role and the positioning of the right arm, which can actually make or break your swing. If you'd like to learn about that right arm secret in detail, then you should go and click on this video next.